The liberal paradigm is collapsing before our eyes, and we in the West are faced with a dire decision. Do we abandon liberalism, or do we perish with it? Liberalism as a philosophy champions the ideals of individual liberty, equality, and the notion of natural rights. And these principles have shaped much of the modern West, influencing everything from our government policies to our morality. But at the heart of liberalism lies a fatal error. It is built on a flawed conception of nature, and all of the presuppositions and assertions of liberalism, such as natural rights, rest upon this misconception, and without it, collapse. Liberalism posits that humans are born with inherent rights such as life, liberty, and property. These rights are considered to be natural, existing prior to and independent from any social or political institutions. According to liberal thought, the purpose of government is to protect these pre-existing natural rights, which will then allow individuals to pursue their own happiness. So liberalism rests upon the belief that humans, in their natural state, are guaranteed certain fundamental rights, are rational actors capable of cooperating peacefully, and that society's role, or the government's role, is merely to facilitate these things. However, a closer examination of nature reveals a starkly different picture. There are no rights or morals in nature. Nature is amoral and often brutally violent. In the natural world, survival is the primary law. In the natural world, survival, the will to power, the will to life, are the primary laws. Predation, competition, and subjugation are the norms, not the exceptions. Species survive by dominating other species and organisms, sometimes through cooperation, but often through force, cunning, and exploitation. This is what Nietzsche observed. Human beings, as a part of nature, are not exempt from the laws of nature. The development of human societies was not based upon natural rights, but rather a series of power struggles, conflicts, and conquests between various competing peoples and tribes. When we look upon the inherently violent and amoral nature of the natural world, it becomes immediately apparent that natural rights are a human construct. The idea of natural rights assumes that humans possess inherent dignity, value, and certain privileges simply by virtue of being human, simply by virtue of existing. It assumes that they are born with them because they were endowed with them by a benevolent and moral God. However, in the natural world, these things, which liberalism calls natural rights, are not at all natural or guaranteed. They are earned through struggle, won by force or cunning. By grounding itself in the notion of natural rights, liberalism builds itself upon a foundation that does not hold up under scrutiny. If nature is inherently violent and amoral, then the concept of natural rights is at best a fiction, and at worst a dangerous delusion that prevents us from recognizing the true nature of nature, the true nature of human nature, the true nature of what life really is and how it behaves. Liberalism relies on several significant falsehoods which are currently destabilizing Western societies. Firstly, it indulges in the illusion that peace and cooperation, rather than group competition, are the default states of human existence. This belief makes liberal societies vulnerable to threats from those who do not share the same assumptions about human nature. You see this with the issue of mass migration, especially in Europe. When the British liberal brings Muslims into Britain, he assumes that they will automatically adopt liberal values once freed from the restrictive bonds of their culture, because he believes that liberal values are natural and intuitive. But the Muslim operates by a completely different, and if we take into account the span of history, a more natural value system, in which religion and collective identity are at the center of their worldview. This means that liberalism undermines itself. By prioritizing individual autonomy over collective identity, liberalism weakens the bonds that hold a society together, make it less resilient in the face of external challenges. It literally becomes unable to defend its own values because of its own values. Again, you see this with mass migration and the liberals' refusal to recognize that Europeans have a collective identity, history, and worldview, which must be defended if it is to be competitive with other value systems, such as Islam. The liberal can only acknowledge the value of his own culture and people insofar as it is related to the value of liberal morality, or for conservatives who are also philosophical liberals, Christian morality. And since the liberal refuses to participate in any form of concrete collective identity, liberalism has no defense against peoples who operate tribally, again, as is natural in human history and in nature. Finally, as we've talked about at length on this channel, liberalism's failure to acknowledge the violent and amoral aspects of nature and human nature leads to policies and moralities that are disconnected from the reality of human existence. Liberalism refuses to acknowledge that pain, suffering, conflict, and constraint are necessary and natural parts of human life, and instead posits that these things are oppressive bonds which can be thrown off to achieve a more natural state of total freedom and comfort. Here you can see its Christian influence. Liberalism's flawed conception of nature is rooted in the historical conflation of nature with the Christian God. In ancient European pagan societies, such as those of the Greeks, nature was understood as a force that was both benevolent and destructive, impartial and unyielding. The gods of these societies were deeply connected with the natural world and governed over it. The gods were not bound by human concepts of morality. Like nature, they could provide sustenance or unleash devastation. The Greek gods embodied the dual spirit of nature in every way: fertility, beauty, and abundance on the one hand, chaos, cruelty, and destruction on the other. Zeus could bring rain to nourish crops or hurl a lightning bolt to set the fields ablaze. Poseidon could offer safe passage across the seas, or conjure storms that would send sailors to their watery doom. And in Greek religion, such as the Dionysian and Eleusinian mysteries, and culture more generally, such as Greek tragedy and the epics, this dual character of nature and life was enshrined and celebrated. Death and rebirth, beauty and horror, pain and ecstasy, triumph and tragedy. The Greeks understood life as governed by forces beyond human control, forces that could be generous or cruel without regard for human morals, hopes, and dreams. The gods were not seen as moral arbiters, but as powerful beings whose actions could be as destructive as they were life-giving. Again, just like the nature which they were so intimately connected with. The idea of an inherently just or moral universe was completely foreign to the European pagans. But the arrival of Christianity in Europe produced a radically different conception of divinity and nature. The Christian God was not an amoral force of nature, but a moral lawgiver, omniscient, omnipotent, and inherently good. This God was concerned with justice, mercy, and the salvation of souls. He was the ultimate source of goodness, justice, and love, and all things which departed from these principles departed from him. Therefore, he was not a part of nature, in which evil clearly exists. He stood above it and apart from it, and the Christian understanding of the world as a moral battleground between good and evil, governed by moral laws where human beings were endowed with a soul and a duty to live in accordance with the commandments of God, was a stark departure from the pagan view of a universe which is amoral and indifferent. And as Christianity took root in Europe, these two contradictory views of divinity were merged. The Christian God became associated with the natural world as the force which animates life and moves all things, a distinctly pagan idea. And so in Christianized Europe, the natural world began to be seen as a manifestation of God's divine will, reflecting his moral order. But this development created a contradiction. How could an inherently good and moral God preside over an amoral, often brutal, natural world? So you can see how the pagan conflation of nature and the divine, which was intuitive for Europeans, carried over when Europe was Christianized and created this confusion and theological contradiction. There are a few different theological solutions to this problem, which mostly rely on attributing some things in nature to God and others to the fall or sin, but none of these are quite satisfying. Either you have to take the pagan view that nature reflects God, and God has therefore mandated death, suffering, and cruelty as necessary parts of life. This is the form of European Christianity which I am partial to. Or you have to take the original Christian view that nature is separate from God and needs to be fundamentally transformed. The liberal belief in natural rights drew upon the Christian notion of a moral universe. Locke and other early liberal thinkers posited that these rights were natural because they were given to man by God in nature. In this way, liberalism inherited the moral framework of the Christian God, while in part divorcing it from its theological context and attempting to root it in the idea of a natural order which is rational and just. As a result, liberalism inherited a conceptual framework that is internally conflicted and fundamentally misunderstands nature. It fundamentally misunderstands man and the world which he lives in, which of course is a dire error. Liberalism was doomed from the start because its principles are at odds with the realities of nature and human nature. And if Western societies are to survive, we must stop being so naively idealistic, and we must confront the harsh realities of nature and of human nature. Usually when a society becomes decadent, that is detached from nature, a more barbaric people, which is still acquainted with nature, conquers them and restarts the cycle of civilization. For the Romans, these people were the Germanic tribes and the Northern European peoples more generally. Today, the West suffers all of the same issues as late-stage Rome, in addition to many others. But there are no barbarians, no reservoir of nature, no frontiers to foster vital peoples left. This means that if we cannot muster up the energy to revive our own civilizations from within, we are likely to experience the greatest civilizational collapse in human history, followed by a long, dark age. But luckily for those who are committed to preventing this, we have a 5,000-year-plus tradition to fall back upon and draw from in the attempt of this great renaissance which our times demand of us. The ancient pagan European peoples understood nature and developed customs, religions, and ethical systems which worked in harmony with nature, celebrated and sanctified the best in nature, and brought order to the violent and chaotic elements of human nature. Their societies celebrated beauty, heroism, and excellence, and promoted virtue, honor, and fertility. Of course, it is forbidden to suggest a return to a pre-liberal or even pre-Christian worldview in the current political landscape. You can go beyond liberalism in the form of various types of progressivism or Marxism, but you can never depart from it. Yet in a time when Western societies have become death cults, bent on self-destruction, this is precisely what is needed. The Greek mystery religions teach us the most sacred secret of life. Despite death, old age, and change, life, again and again, miraculously reemerges from darkness, like Persephone from Hades. In each generation and in each season, life is reborn anew, and so it is with civilizations. And I feel that a great spring is upon us, and it is time for a rebirth of that ancient Western tradition which has survived since the earliest European civilizations, reborn again and again despite cataclysm and catastrophe. I feel that our Renaissance is coming.
To support this channel and gain access to the ARC's community and exclusive, long-form content, check the links in the description. Thank you for your support. It makes this channel possible.